This is The Reason interview with Nick Gillespie, where I go deep with the artists, entrepreneurs, and scholars who are making the world a more libertarian, or at least a more interesting place, by championing free minds and free markets. My guest today is Sarah McLaughlin. She's a senior scholar at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. You know it as FIRE. And she's the author of the new book, Authoritarians in the Academy: How the Internationalization of Higher Education and Borderless Censorship Threaten Free Speech. We discuss how governments in places like China and the United Arab Emirates are restricting academic freedom and expression, not just in their own countries, but at colleges and universities right here in America. And we talk about whether it was a good idea for comedians to agree to censor their material at Saudi Arabia's Riyadh Comedy Festival, and what to make of Donald Trump's continuing minimization of the murder of Washington Post contributor Jamal Khashoggi by Saudi operatives. Here is The Reason interview with Sarah McLaughlin. Sarah McLaughlin, thanks for talking to Reason.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, the new book you have out from Johns Hopkins Press is Authoritarians in the Academy, and this is about how foreign interference in higher education threatens free speech, even in America, not to mention their own countries. Let's talk about that in just a second. But first, while we're taping this, and Donald Trump has just recently kind of suggested something that is relevant to FIRE's mission as well as your interest, which is that the contributor to the Washington Post who was hacked to death, the Saudi contributor to the Washington Post, Jamal Khashoggi, was hacked to death at the apparent command of MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, in the Turkish embassy some years ago. Trump at a press conference said, well, he kind of had it coming. How do you respond to things like that?
Well, there's a few disturbing aspects to that. One is just that, we have the United States, the president of the United States, and the U.S., for good reason, has been seen as the leader on free expression. So to have the president of the United States to a foreign leader who, for what we know, was involved in the murder of Khashoggi, to have him suggest that it's not a big deal, it's kind of giving a blank check to dictators around the world to say, it's not a big deal if you suppress, silence, and perhaps even murder your critics. But what was also disturbing about that was that he suggested that because some people considered Khashoggi to be controversial, that it was less problematic that he was murdered. And this is the basis of free expression, right? The idea that you shouldn't suffer consequences for your speech that are legal or violence because people don't like what you say. We don't need free speech for people who are popular and beloved by all.
Yeah. Do you, part of the criticism against Trump is that, how could he even talk to the Saudi government after this and whatnot? And, when it happened, he kind of said, he didn't say this was a objectively good thing, but he also kind of said, these things happen. And he reiterated that in the press conference. This is a thorny issue, right? Which is a little bit different than universities dealing with overseas campuses or foreign students, although we'll get to that. And it's actually also very related. With a regime like Saudi Arabia, which is trying to kind of whitewash its image or burnish its image, and MBS is doing this in all sorts of ways. And we'll talk about the Riyadh Comedy Festival in just a second. But do you say, this one thing happens and then we cast you out and we never talk with you again? Or how do you effectively bring in a nation which shows little compunction in protecting speech or basic human rights for many of its citizens? Does that mean that you just say, hey, we can't do anything with you? Or, how does that work?
When it comes to politicians, especially presidents, obviously they need to keep up ties and communications with foreign powers, even ones that we think are deeply authoritarian. But I think what they don't need to do is proactively downplay the crimes that those governments have committed. And I think for people, there's still who knows how many people trapped in Saudi prisons. Many women, especially, who have dared to criticize Saudi Arabia's treatment of women. I think we do a great disservice to them if, in our communications with those countries, we essentially just throw our hands up in the air and say, well, we're just going to forget all of that and let that all go. And that doesn't mean we need to, permanently cut ties. But I don't think that we should keep up ties in a way that is deeply damaging to free expression.
Yeah, I was thinking about the press conference, which I watched part of. It reminded me, because I'm old enough to remember this, but when Jimmy Carter really started, when he in the late 70s said, that American foreign policy was going to take human rights into a serious consideration in how we deal with things. And then the Shah in Iran fell, and it was seen as, it created this dynamic where it's like, it's not do you do business with terrible regimes, but how do you do that when they clearly do not comport with all of American rights, and where they often throw up in America's face, when masked ICE agents are dragging the streets of Chicago and, beating up old people who are American citizens. Like, who are we to get on a high horse, right?
It's really interesting. I've been following, I like to see what other nations, how they react to censorship issues in the U.S. or human rights issues in the U.S. And in the trial of Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, one of the judges, she suggested that there wasn't anything wrong with the prosecution of Jimmy Lai. And she pointed to censorship that was happening in the United States and the UK, right. Countries that are seen as democratic, liberal, respective of free expression, although the UK has had a number of issues on that front lately. But we do a great service to other countries that want to censor people when we encourage censorship here, because they can point to the United States and say, look, they have the First Amendment. They're seen as, the global defenders of free speech. If they're going to censor, it's obviously okay for us to do as well. We all have our own rules about free speech. So it's a gift to them.
You wrote about the Riyadh Comedy Festival, that happened this fall, and you took a couple of the major players there to task. Bill Burr, who said that, he got paid a lot of money to go there, so he was going to do it, and Dave Chappelle. You singled out a strange comment from him where he said, it was easier to talk about the Charlie Kirk killing in front of Saudi Arabians or, in Riyadh than it was in America. How should we think about these kinds of cultural events? And again, this is something, MBS, who in many ways is a modernizer. He is somebody who wants to get Saudi Arabia certainly beyond an oil economy. He is somebody who wants to, by almost all accounts, normalize relationships with Israel, and build a different model for, kind of Arab, Jewish relationships in the Middle East. He is, he does not like Islamic fundamentalists, at least if he doesn't control them. He's done a lot of different things to make Saudi Arabia kind of a place where, they're trying to make it the next UAE or something like that, or the next Dubai. And of course, we'll talk in an academic context how that might be kind of terrifying in many ways. But these types of events are designed to create a kind of cultural exchange. And obviously the nation that is, authoritarian benefits more probably than the few individuals who get paid a lot to show up there. But how should comedians or performers or, writers and things like that, how should they engage with that type of entreaty to say, here, come over here and get a lot of money and do a couple of jokes for us?
Yeah, I think it's really complicated, and there's never a clear, exact formula. But, especially when you're looking at comedy, and to me, the purpose and the role of comedy is to challenge power. It's to use laughter to subvert the powerful in ways that are actually really difficult to recover from sometimes. Like, one joke can sometimes take down a presidency. And so to have comedians, I think, so nakedly be willing to say, I'm going to give up what makes comedy powerful, what makes comedy worthwhile for a very big paycheck. And to be clear, these are people who are, for the most part, already very wealthy. So it's not they're taking the paycheck from Saudi Arabia to ensure their kids can have food.
Yeah, so like they get leg braces or something, right?
Yeah, it's to make sure that you can have another really fancy car. So to me, I'm a little bit suspicious of the idea that there's some noble purpose here, of cultural exchange. Sometimes I don't know that there's real honesty from the people who are making that argument sometimes. But to me, the simple basic rule is that if you're taking part in cultural exchange where you are forced to abide by very severe rules about what you can say about the government, and you also clearly aren't even supposed to publicly discuss that you're under those rules in the first place, that to me is a sign that what's happening is more something else than cultural exchange. And so I think sometimes we can tell ourselves nice little fictions like I'm doing something good, I'm helping bringing comedy to the rest of the world. And sure, to some extent that's true. But I think some people who are pushing that line need to do a little bit of soul searching and be honest about what they actually think they're accomplishing and why they're actually doing it in the first place.
Well, that's a great entry point into your book, Authoritarians in the Academy, which looks at how American universities opening up campuses in foreign countries or having exchanges with various universities and places, and a lot of foreign students coming here with an emphasis on China, the Chinese government, as well as Chinese students who make up a large number of exchange students, or did until very recently. And, the Trump administration seems to not be fully clear on, do they want more Chinese students or no foreign students, but Chinese students are okay, et cetera, and things like that. Because there are, universities, even more than comedians, if that's possible, are constantly wrapping and shrouding their financial motives in highfalutin speech about, the sanctity of knowledge and enlightenment values and free speech and free inquiry and academic freedom. And then what you detail in the book is how craven many American universities are when they open campuses up overseas in authoritarian countries, and also how craven they are in caving to clearly government-directed foreign government attempts to shut down free speech on American campuses. Could you give a kind of précis of what Authoritarians in the Academy is seeking to highlight?
Yeah, so ultimately, I want people to better understand the full picture of academic censorship that takes place on American campuses. So there has been a lot of ink spilled in recent years over free expression, academic freedom on campus. But it's been frustrating to me because I think in that conversation, we have missed a really pernicious threat and a really big part of the picture because a lot of people who are the target aren't necessarily Americans, or a lot of the speech that is targeted perhaps isn't speech that most Americans are engaging in because it's about foreign governments and maybe that's not as relevant to them. It's not about race or abortion, so it doesn't get quite as much attention. But I want people to understand that we actually, the way that we have internationalized higher education has introduced really extensive threats to the way that we understand the world and the way that we speak about the world. And these are things that don't just affect what we say now, but also the research that we create now are things that we may rely on decades in the future. And so it's really important. These things have lasting effects, especially in higher education, because, it's not just a post on social media. The higher ed shapes the way that the entire world understands itself. So to have authoritarian governments, especially China, deeply embedded in that structure and silencing people, censoring people, threatening people, it's going to have permanent, lasting effects on the way that we basically understand how the world operates. And
of course, given that colleges, by many estimates or analyses, we kind of reached peak college enrollment around 2010 or 2011 for demographic reasons. There's 4,400 or something colleges and universities in the country. They are going to be fighting over a shrinking pool of students as well as state funds and things like that. A lot of them look overseas for the sons and daughters of authoritarian regimes to come here and pay full freight at schools. They like to open up campuses because that's very exciting for, it gives them a marketing edge over other American universities. If you have a campus in Luxembourg or, Rome or Japan or Beijing or wherever, you focus or you talk about how the kind of authoritarian impact falls in two kind of broad buckets. One is that it creates censors without borders, and the other is a strategy of sensitivity exploitation. Let's talk about each of those. And can you start with the censors without borders? How does this play out, and what's a good illustrative story of how governments from abroad are kind of clamping down on speech in American universities?
Yeah, so Censors Without Borders is sort of more broad of a concept, but it's very simple. It's the idea that authoritarians are seeking to silence people that are not within their own borders to do so. So they're saying, you know what, I don't like what this person in New York is saying. I'm going to do something about it. And that could be an authoritarian in Beijing who decides that they have no legal authority to do this. They have no right to do so, but they're going to use whatever means they can, legal or not, to try to shut people up. And so a lot of the target of this has been international students from China on U.S. campuses. And so the more extreme examples that we're looking at are students I've spoken to. Some of them have had their family members brought in for questioning in China because of what students in the U.S. have done. And it's a really powerful pressure point. No one wants to be responsible for their family suffering. So it's pretty simple. It's easy to say, is what I'm doing, is the protest I'm engaging in, is the online posts I'm posting, are they really worth putting my parents through this, or my sister through this, or my brother through this? And a lot of people are going to conclude no. And so that's a really effective and disturbing method that I think the Chinese government especially has been engaging in. And we have hundreds of thousands of international students from China in the US. And so obviously a lot of these students are not going to be loudly political. They're not going to be walking through campus with signs, but there are enough that we know what it looks like. And it looks like sometimes a state security official contacting the student on social media or on WeChat saying, we know what you're doing. We're watching you. You need to be careful. Sometimes it's a call from mom saying, why are there police here telling me I have to come in for questioning, and saying that you've been doing something illegal. And so that actually has a lot of effect. And so some people I talk to, Americans will say, okay, well, what do I care? That doesn't affect me. But it actually does affect you. It affects you if the people all around you don't feel that they can fully participate in conversations, in civic life. And that also limits what you can experience, what you can learn, who you can speak to. And so our rights are all interconnected in that way. So if you have perhaps thousands of students on campus who feel that they're going to face severe repercussion for speaking out, you lose a lot of important conversation, perhaps from people who have the most to say.
Well, or certainly a diverse, a different point of view. And you stress that, this is in keeping with FIRE's larger mission about kind of viewpoint diversity, and also people's presence should not be contingent upon them saying, I'm not going to say anything upsetting or weird or anything, right? Like both in a classroom, in a faculty lounge, or even as an immigrant. Would you, a part of the stuff too is that like these are not necessarily, you're not talking about people who are, creating replicas of the Statue of Liberty, or the Freedom statue that was in Tiananmen Square. It's people making random Facebook comments or even comments in classes. And I guess this is particularly strong with China, partly because of the number of students institutions that are on various campuses. They've created a lot of different semi-academic presences, whether it's things like the Confucius Institute, which seems to be declining a little bit, but or Chinese student groups that actually police what people say in classrooms and things like that.
Yeah, so the Confucius Institutes were, they peaked about a decade or two ago, and they have been on swift decline for a lot of reasons in the U.S. But ultimately what the Confucius Institutes are, it's something managed by the Chinese government, and they just link up a foreign university, in this case an American university, with a Chinese university. And so they create that partnership. And there's some funding, usually a couple $100,000 that the Chinese government provides. And then they provide staff and educational materials. And, you know, you can say this is a nice thing. It's engagement, it's exchange.
And it is a kind of cultural and academic exchange, which is not completely new. And you talk a little bit about the history of this, but especially after World War II, as the American university system grew, and we wanted to start projecting our values throughout, particularly Europe, sometimes in Latin America, and other places, and Asia as well. Like, the American universities would link up with European universities, or countries like Germany in particular really flooded America with a lot of money because they wanted to rehabilitate their things. So there were a lot of German-backed funds for people to travel in Germany or to learn about German stuff here. So the idea of this is not new or necessarily nefarious.
No, it's pretty standard soft power, and we still see it today. There are UK and German and French institutes that do this as well.
I mean, this is like the Fulbright scholarships in a way, or et cetera. Yeah.
It's on, in theory, it's a good thing. In practice, it has not always been such a good thing. And we saw, this wasn't taking place at every Confucius Institutes, but there were incidents where people who were involved in the Confucius Institutes, who were sent here by the Chinese government to work there, intervened or interfered with university events to try to make them more palatable to the Chinese government. So one of those specifically was at NC State, which had invited the Dalai Lama, who is a frequent target of censorship that I write about in the book.
And just for the uninitiated, the Dalai Lama is the king by I don't know what it is. He's the leader of Tibet, which has been occupied by the Chinese government since the late 50s or early 60s, and he's a leader in exile who the Chinese don't recognize. Yeah,
and he's perceived as a subversive and seditious spiritual and political leader. And so they don't want anyone, it doesn't matter if you're in the United States or Canada, they don't want anyone listening to what he has to say. And so NC State, they received this complaint from their Confucius Institute, who suggested that it was going to harm the university's relationship with China, and they ultimately chose to cancel the invitation because they flat out admitted not only did they want to preserve their relationship with the Confucius Institute, but they also wanted to protect the state of North Carolina's relationship with China for trading opportunities. Yeah. And so, it's fascinating, disturbing how much meaning what a lot of people would think like, oh, that's just one campus talk because that's such a big deal. But it can have so much meaning. It can create serious financial consequences. I mean, we all saw what happened with the NBA after Daryl Morey tweeted, stand with Hong Kong. That cost the NBA hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue because of retaliation from the Chinese government. So,
and that's really kind of the model, right? That, or rather that's one way of understanding what you're talking about, especially with censorship that crosses borders, that the NBA, which is, I guess James Naismith, the inventor of basketball, I think was Canadian, but it's a very American game. It defines, late capitalism, let's call it, the past 100 years in America. It's a fantastic export that is super popular in China, particularly. And then you have a general manager of a team, basically say, hey, Hong Kong should, good luck to you. And a shitstorm comes down on him that, that the NBA sides with the Chinese government to say, like, hey, don't do this speech.
And I think what's especially interesting in that example is that the NBA has explicitly been a sort of activist league. It has encouraged activism among its teams, among its players. And so, it sort of became a question of which kind of activism is not okay if it becomes too costly. And so that's ultimately, I think, the crux of these questions. How much are our values worth? We can say we have values all day long, but when we're forced to go to bat for them and when we're forced to perhaps consider losing a lot of money for them, are we going to keep those values? And I think a lot of people haven't.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk more about like your ideas for reform of this kind of stuff. But just briefly, with say, this is also true of Hollywood movies, and you talk about that and the NBA, and then also colleges that have campuses, in China. And like, the message comes through that like, if you're going to invite the Dalai Lama, or if you're going to have panels that discuss in any way, shape or form, any topic that offends the Chinese Communist Party or somebody, like you might get the call to say, hey, this is really bad. And, the rhetoric is always you're making them unsafe. But really what's unsafe is like your campus in China might not, maybe we'll end the contract or something like that. Should schools just be unilateral, like, fuck you, we're going to do what we're going to do? Or like, how does that work? Because they don't certainly. Part of the problem, which is shot throughout your book, is that colleges and universities are terrible stewards of free speech, academic freedom, and like actual, free expression.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I think if you have values, well, so I guess step back a little bit. Yeah. If you are a public university in the U.S., the First Amendment binds you. So. In some cases, you don't have the option to censor because you're violating the law. Obviously, that is not something that public universities have had a great track record of at all times. Yeah. But it's a great question because it's not even just relevant to questions about international censorship. It's also relevant to what's been happening in the U.S. in the past 8 months or 10 months or whatever it's been. Universities have been in a position with the Trump administration where they're being asked to subvert their values or to accept restrictions on their rights for political expediency or for financial gain. Right. And what's been happening for the past 2 decades globally, universities have been pressured to abandon their values for financial gain. So I think there's actually some parallels between what's been happening lately and what's been happening more broadly for the past couple of decades. And I think we have to reach the conclusion that at a certain point, universities are not worth very much to society if they're not able to make that right choice, if they're not able to say, I'm going to stand by my values, even if it's really costly for me. And that's why I've been so praiseworthy of what Harvard's been doing, because Harvard, which has not necessarily always done a good job of handling free expression when it comes to the Chinese government, is at least standing up to what's happening with the Trump administration now. And that's what I want to see across the board. I want to see universities say our values aren't for sale, and we're not going to let you punish or browbeat us into selling them out.
The other broad strategy, and I guess we implicitly touched on it, that you talk about that foreign governments use often, or other actors within the university system, is sensitivity exploitation. Can you talk about that? Because that seems to be a great strategy to use on universities in particular.
Yeah, so this is something that I have been watching for a number of years and have been disturbed and strangely fascinated by to watch unfold. But essentially, by sensitivity exploitation, I mean people using appeals to sensitivity or anti-bias or compassion to argue for censorship of speech that's actually very basic political expression about a government, and in this case, in the book, the Chinese government. And so some examples that we're looking at, one that caught some attention in the U.S. a few years ago was at George Washington University, where some students who turned out were actually international students from China and Hong Kong, they posted artwork that was critical of the Beijing Winter Olympics and human rights abuses in China. And a couple of student groups, including the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, who I write about in the book, they complained directly to the university. They said that it was hurtful, that it was offensive, that it was dangerous for Asian students to have to be around this because it was going to create hate against them.
Even if it originated from fellow Chinese students.
Yeah, and so what's interesting was no one knew who had put that artwork up at the time. So it's sort of a fascinating question: does it become more or less acceptable depending on who had posted it? But the university, and this was shocking to me, the president said in an email, he said he agreed and that he was personally offended by the posters, which, to me were pretty basic criticisms of the Chinese government. It was by an Australian Chinese artist who actually has been censored by the Chinese government before. The university machinery went to work. They took down the flyers, and he actually promised to investigate them, which I think should have been a moment for universities across the country where they looked at it and they said, okay, we've let this get out of control, where a student could be perhaps punished by the university after an investigation for criticizing a government. I mean, that's shocking. It doesn't even matter which government it is.
In
Should
that
be any
case,
government.
or I mean, I guess not in an ad hominem attack, but any kind of professor's research or student action, or thinking, right? That's what colleges are for. In that case, did George Washington kind of say like, oh, well, the real crime here, we don't care about the content. What we're really worried about is, it was outside of the bulletin board that we allow people to express dissent on. Were they trying to be technical? Or, I mean, in the book, I mean, it really comes across and I guess, we're talking just as like all these Epstein emails are coming out, and, emails are like the universal acid, right? Like it just shows how craven people can be. But it's not, they're not just like, this would have been fine if you were standing in the 3 square foot area that we allow speech to happen.
No, it's a good question. No, George Washington's president made very clear that the flyers are being taken down because they were hurtful or offensive. And this is one of those moments where sensitivity exploitation, I think, is so effective because no university wants to be seen as a home to offensive and biased speech. And so when they hear that kind of complaint, they say, oh, we need to act on that. But if they don't really think that through first, what they're going to be acting on is students saying, I want to protest against the government that's violating my rights. It's pretty shocking. And, we've seen demands made like these all over. At the University of Chicago, the CSSA chapter there, they complained after Nathan Law was invited to speak. Nathan Law is an exiled pro-democracy legislator from Hong Kong who can't return home or else he'll be returned to prison. They said that the university was hurting them and that they were going to tell other Chinese students not to come to the university because it was a welcoming place for them. Unfortunately, University of Chicago, which, has good free speech policies, it did not give in to that. But at Brandeis University, CSSA chapter there, they tried to get a panel canceled that was hosting an event about Uyghur rights. And they had a woman there who's talking about her brother who was still imprisoned in Xinjiang. And so, that's a really disturbing idea that a university could be appealed to censor this kind of speech based on hurt feelings. I think the most on-brand one, it was at McMaster University in Canada. They also were having a Uyghur speaker there, and a student group attempted to get the students who invited that speaker in trouble under a hate speech policy.
Wow.
They said that speaker's expression and her invitation was a violation of hate speech rule. And so I think that really lays bare, some of the problems with hate speech policing,
For sure,
B, these kinds of appeals.
Yeah. And Canadians more generally, let's be honest, right? Can you put that in a broader historical context? The free speech on campuses. We kind of take for granted or took for granted that the idea is that you would go to college and then you would argue everything all night and all day, and you would have controversial speakers come, not despite them being controversial, but because they were. And I went to undergrad in the 80s. And every day there would be a former CIA director one day, and he would get protested. But they would they would speak, but there'd be people protesting outside. The next day, because this was the 80s, they'd have somebody from the Sandinista government in Nicaragua talking about how America is just is a murderous nation, et cetera. And then you would have Christian evangelists come and try to proselytize, and students would shout back and yell at them. And that, you kind of take that for granted, or you assume, oh, college was always like that. But it wasn't. It was really only in the 60s that, starting at Berkeley and then elsewhere, that this idea that colleges were places for massive open free speech, both in the classroom, in the research of professors, and among the student body. FIRE has done a lot of work on this, and you have as well. But what happened to get to a point where these kind of sensitivity, exploiters can really work the system?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different factors. One of which is just, as you mentioned, there has been sort of a change in how universities treat broader questions about free speech. And so we've seen a rise of speech codes. We've seen a rise of sometimes outright unconstitutional policies that limit what students and academics can say, what they can do based on the offensiveness or the hurtfulness of their speech. And so we're more accustomed to seeing those policies in terms of American controversies. So like race or gender or abortion, things like that, guns. And so what I'm seeing is that, that's the risk here, that these policies that we've allowed to flourish are kind of opening the door for other actors to say, all right, well, these policies are here. If you say you're going to act against this kind of offensive speech, well, guess what I think's offensive? Someone criticizing the Chinese government. And also, we've touched on the financial issues a number of times here, but the way that universities are in a constant search for funding, the way that they have become more corporate institutions, corporate bodies, I think it really explains a lot of what we're seeing here. In the book, I touch a little bit on all of the, humiliating and shocking apologies that corporations have made to the Chinese government for accidentally saying Hong Kong's a country, for offensives that they didn't even realize they were engaging in. And sometimes they issue these fawning apologies that are sort of humiliating to read. God, no, you feel secondhand embarrassment.
And you also point out how sometimes the English language version and the Chinese version are quite different, which makes it even worse.
Yeah, you will sometimes see if a university is apologizing for an incident that related to the Chinese government, the English language version will have some mention perhaps of free speech, of university rights, things like that. And then the Chinese language version, no, these are our rights, free expression matters. It's usually just a full simpering apology. Yeah. I think, one of the most disturbing examples was John Cena's apology, where he, said over and over and over again how sorry he was that he accidentally implied Taiwan was a country. These are people that are making those decisions for financial reasons. And as we see universities look more and more like corporate bodies, as they have larger bureaucratic bodies, as they have declined faculty power. So as the exchange of power, as the people who want the university to have a good brand, that want a university to make money, as they get more of a say in higher education, and as faculty members who can barely even keep on to tenure these days, and as a lot of faculty members are in a really precarious position where they're on part-time contracts, they're adjuncts, they don't really have the means to protect their own rights, let alone advocate for free expression more broadly in higher ed. I think we're going to just see more and more of this because it's what it is. It's corporate decision making that protects finances, and
it turns out either that academic reputations change so slowly at such a slow pace, or they're not really that tied to basic principles that if you're a Harvard or NYU comes up a couple times in the book, a George Washington University, or big state schools that open up overseas campuses, if they cave to a foreign government, it takes decades for that to really filter through to people being like, I don't want to go there. And, one of the things that was interesting to me was that you also talked about how, and I guess this is particularly true in China, where for faculty, that schools that open up, colleges and universities that open up campuses in China, say, hey, if you go there as a faculty member, you are covered by American rights and ability to do your research, to teach what you want, et cetera. And then not only does that get kind of pulled, but then you find out that the colleges in the foreign countries are technically run completely by Chinese, and it's almost like a licensing deal for the name. And so then you get screwed. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when you brought up how sometimes there's a different English language apology and Chinese language apology, that's sort of what we're seeing here. The ways that universities have pitched their satellite campuses to Americans are very different than how those satellite campuses are pitched or perceived or actually run in China. So, you'll have university leaders who want to start or continue these satellite campuses. They will say, sometimes even in, when they're talking to Congress, they will say, we have full authority over these institutions. This is NYU. We make the calls. We decide what happens there. And then, they actually start the institute, they grow it, expand it, and then you find out, no, actually, it has to be, they actually kind of minority owners in a way of these institutions they start abroad. And it's a way for them to perhaps create joint partnerships or foreign campuses, but it's a way for them to grant degrees abroad. But ultimately, they do not have the final say to a certain extent what happens on that campus. And I think it's sort of obvious, right? Of course, the Chinese government isn't going to let NYU do whatever it wants within China. And so it's sort of almost silly that universities have been, I think, so strongly advancing this pitch. And I think it's because they know that a lot of Americans are going to be uncomfortable with this idea that will essentially plant really prestigious university names as a tool for foreign governments to control and to influence and interfere with. And we know that there is some degree of censorship that's happening. It's obviously not as severe as what would happen to a Chinese university, not an American university, but Kean University, which is a public university in New Jersey, for example, there was a whistleblower there that said faculty were warned that they couldn't speak about some pretty basic political issues, which I'm sure won't be a surprise to anyone: Tiananmen, Tibet, Taiwan. And so, most people wouldn't be comfortable with a university opening a campus like this with the knowledge that faculty are going to be handed a sheet of paper saying, here's a list of topics you can't talk about, or else you're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble. And
the institution. So then you get hectored by them. We've talked almost exclusively about China so far, but you write, that, in places like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Hungary, also are clamping down in various ways. You tell a story of of a scholar named Matthew Hedge, who was in the United Arab Emirates, correct? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Could you kind of summarize what his experience was? Because in many ways that strikes me as, one of the most outrageous worst case examples of the large picture that you're trying to paint here.
Yeah, so Matthew Hedges, he was at the time a UK student. He was, I think, getting his PhD, and he was traveling to the UAE, where he'd been a number of times. I think he lived there for some time. And when he landed in the airport, he was told he had to come in for questioning, and that started off a months-long nightmarish hellish experience where he was essentially forced to sign a false confession that he was a spy for the UK government, that he, was doing all these evil things. He couldn't even, if I recall correctly, read the language of the apology he was forced to sign. And he was going to be sentenced to life in prison for spying. And, he obviously had severe mental health issues while he was, trapped in his questioning. He was tortured. And the response from universities like NYU that have expanded into the UAE was not what you would want to see. Basically, how can we be running a campus in a country without certainty that the students and scholars that are there are not going to be swept in and told they're going to spend life in prison for their research? And so that's, I think, key to understanding what's wrong with these campuses. There's a lot of financial opportunity that comes from it. There are, it's great for a university's brand to be global, to be in the Middle East. But if they can't answer the very basic question of what they're going to do if that happens to their students, who can trust these institutions, and who can trust that they're there for the right reasons?
Right. And of course, they're, in the whataboutism, kind of dimension of this, the U.S. now, particularly, since Donald Trump came back into office, in at least a couple of high profile cases, have threatened students. And I think it's mostly students. I guess there's been some faculty, but for, columns or for attending protests, typically against Israel, or writing, in support of Gaza and Palestinians and whatnot, with being kicked out of the country or being arrested or whatever. So this is kind of the world that this stuff is unfolding in now.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we haven't quite gotten to the solutions part of the conversation, but, I want to preempt that by saying that what's been happening in this past year in the U.S. has made this problem a lot more difficult to address, because, solutions for this only really work if the U.S. actually stands by its First Amendment, by its free expression values. And so that's been, I think really tragic this past year, because the reason why I wrote this book was because I actually think there's something beautiful and amazing about having a country where international students can come here, and they may come here from an unfree place like China or Russia or Saudi Arabia and think, wow, for the first time in my life, I can say what I think. I can read the books I want. I can Google what I want without someone coming to my door to take me away. But guess what? Now they might have someone coming to their door and knocking to take them away. And so, I think that we are really torching something that makes the U.S. so special right now. I can't imagine what a country could do better than be a place where the world's dissidents feel that they can finally speak their mind for the first time. And so,
or maybe not even dissidents, right? Maybe free thinkers. Because I don't know about you, but like when I went to college, I didn't really have any ideas. So I was like hungry for all sorts of stuff. I didn't know what I was stepping in.
Or maybe, the world's future dissidents finally get a chance to encounter ideas that they could perhaps take home with them that could, make them important politicians or thinkers in their own country someday. And it's a tragedy because a lot of the solutions for it require the U.S. to take more seriously the rights of international students. And we are very distinctly not doing that right now. We're doing the opposite.
Yeah. Although and it's interesting because universities, and I know this from, my own academic background, but various friends and actually even family members in schools, foreign students typically are a real cash cow because they come in wherever they are. They almost always are paying full tuition, like the list price tuition, which nobody else pays, so that, you want to keep them coming. But then, it's a real tough nut for universities.
It's funny right now because there's been a lot of discussion about, we need to get rid of international students. They're taking spots from American students. They're actually helping to subsidize spots for American students who pay less than them. But it is a major fear for universities that they're going to lose access to these students. It's been something they've feared for a long time, that someone like the Chinese government will retaliate. It's rare, but it has happened. Speaking of the Dalai Lama again, there was a Canadian university that was de-recognized in China because it invited the Dalai Lama to speak. And so obviously Chinese students stopped going there until the Chinese government reversed
the worst thing about that, too, as somebody who's seen the Dalai Lama speak several times, like, he's really not that interesting. But obviously he's a stand-in for a powerful, almost existential cause of freedom and national autonomy, but also individual rights. How did you get interested in this? You've been at FIRE now for a while. You went to college in Drexel, graduated about 10 or so years ago. Is that right?
Yeah. Oh my God. When did I graduate? 11 years ago. Yeah.
Okay. So, what did you study? You went to Drexel. What did you study there, and how did you end up working at FIRE?
Yeah, so I studied political science and history, and part of the reason why I went to Drexel was because Drexel runs this really good co-op program. So they ensure that 6 months of your time there, you're just going to be working full time at employer in your field. And the employer in my field that I end up working with was FIRE. And so that was in 2012 that I was working there as an undergrad intern. And then I really loved the work. I'd always been interested in civil liberties. So I was so passionate about that I stayed on forever. So I've been there about 13 years now. But what got me to, from that starting point to this book, was that for a number of years, I was working on FIRE's, our classic cases. So students and faculty members who were dealing with censorship of some sort. But I was, doing that work, I was starting to see more and more that free speech crisis that I said earlier that I think was not receiving the appropriate attention or acknowledgement. And it was that, it's not just these local controversies to the U.S. that we need to understand. It's that we actually have a lot of people here who are being censored and silenced in ways that escape our notice, but really impact what we know about the world and what can happen on our campuses.
So let's talk about some of the solutions. What you've sketched out some of them, but what are the main ways to change this dynamic, and hopefully in a way that doesn't just have authoritarian countries say, okay, we're not going to interact with you at all, or we're only going to do it on the worst terms possible.
Yeah, so a few things. First, when it comes to international students, here's kind of the issue that universities are in. They are actually sort of disincentivized from paying attention to international students' rights, because if you start talking about the rights of your Chinese students and how they should be able to speak freely, maybe suddenly that's going to do harm to your partnerships in China and to perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars that are coming in. So universities need to be very clear that they take international students' rights seriously and that they are never going to put any financial opportunity, any partnership ahead of any one student's rights. I think that needs to be made very clear, because I've spoken to students who, I think for very good reasons, like the students at George Washington University, really believe that their universities are going to sell them out for whatever reason, whether it's student complaints, whether it's government complaints. And so they need to make clear that they're going to have policies in place that protect students, and that obviously they can't stop the Chinese government from threatening their students, but they're going to do what they can to protect them if they're facing threats, and to make sure they're investigating that kind of thing. When it comes to their global partnerships, there's a few different ways to look at it, but the rule I'm approaching now is that if a university can at least openly talk about what the laws and rules are on the ground, then they probably shouldn't be pursuing that partnership, because it suggests to me that if there is some kind of rights violations like Matthew Hedges, that they're not going to be able to effectively do something about it. So I think they need to reevaluate all of these partnerships and satellite campuses, joint institutes that they've been searching for abroad, especially because some of them may have started 10 or 15 years ago, and a lot can change in 10 or 15 years. And so, China has changed a lot in the past 10 or 15 years. It's gotten a lot more repressive. So they need to look at that. And they also need to have very clear policies in place about what they're going to do if they receive some kind of government demand for censorship, if there is a rights violation. And it needs to be clear and on the table that they're going to leave if they can't protect their community members' rights. And so, there's a reason why foreign governments want these partnerships too. It's not just what universities get. Other governments also get things out of it too. So universities need to consider that they actually do have some power here. There's a reason why Saudi Arabia is trying to get American universities, and they've succeeded to plan to open satellite campuses in Riyadh. It's because it says something about those governments. So, universities aren't just these powerless victims. They need to actually stand up and see that they have some sway here as well, and to try to advocate for it.
Do you feel like that's happening more, or is there a university or a couple of colleges that you think have been really exemplary and kind of drawing a line and saying, okay, you've got to change this, or we're pulling out, and have affected change with a foreign government or situation?
Unfortunately, not really. There have been a couple that have looked at it and decided. I think Wesleyan University was one of them that looked at it and said, you know what, there are too many academic freedom concerns here, so we're not going to move forward. But those are absolutely the outliers. There are not many universities that are able to resist that, the big dollar signs floating in the air. When it comes to this. So we unfortunately don't have a lot of good examples. I do think, right now there is a lot of pressure on universities, congressional pressure to revisit their satellite campuses abroad. What will happen there, I don't know. Again, one of the big issues right now and difficulties here is universities are so concerned about losing grants and financial threats in the U.S. that I don't think they're going to be willing to sacrifice financial opportunities from abroad right now, because if you have the risk of losing hundreds of millions of dollars in research funding, the U.S., you're not going to say now's a good time to lose the money from the UAE too. Yeah.
Are there any countries that are particularly good, kind of emerging countries that are particularly good at I don't know, either bringing in American universities and being like, yeah, we really want you to run wild. We want your expertise. We want that model here, as opposed to we want the prestige and we might want some specific research or, kind of STEM-based connections that would help us.
I think there are definitely some satellite campuses and partnerships in Europe, in Japan, that are run obviously in a different manner than what we're looking at here. What's a shame is that, 20 years ago, I think maybe Hong Kong would have been one of those examples, because Hong Kong was so much significantly freer, and it was a huge outpost for global academic freedom hubs. And I don't think those partnerships have gone away, but obviously the situation in Hong Kong has changed so much over the past 5 or 10 years that those great opportunities have essentially disappeared. But I think Hong Kong was one of those places that had that promise.
Mm-hmm. Do you think in the U.S., and this is a larger question, for FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression that you work at, has there been a serious vibe shift? It's, since Trump won about a year ago, since he's been in office, since the beginning of 2025, there was that discussion that, okay, something has changed on college campuses. I just read an interview with Jill Lepore, the Harvard historian, who is highly regarded, as kind of a left-wing progressive, but she talked about how during kind of peak wokeness as well as COVID and whatnot, she felt embarrassed at how much she, was silent on various things. So she was talking about the Me Too movement as well in the late teens. And I see more kind of confessions like that, like, oh, yeah, we really needed to speak up more. Do you feel like the American speech environment is getting better? And is it getting better at colleges, or, what would you say, from a FIRE kind of point of view?
It's tough to say. I think there's definitely been more widespread discussion about how perhaps universities do need some degree of reform when it comes to, not just free speech and academic freedom, but tuition, things like that. Yeah. So I think that's definitely on the table. Obviously, the kind of unconstitutional reform that's being pushed right now is not the answer to that.
Can you explain that? I'm sorry, just real briefly to drill on that for a second. You mean the way that the Trump administration is trying to cut specific deals with universities to maintain federal funding?
Yes, exactly.
Explain how is that unconstitutional?
Yeah, so he's, essentially trying to force universities to adopt sometimes very explicit limits on their rights, on their community members' rights. And so, these universities, they do have rights themselves. And so they have the authority to set their policies. And so to have the federal government come in and say, if you don't censor the kind of speech that we tell you to, you don't get this money. That's not something that the government's able to do under the First Amendment. So that's pretty basic stuff. And it's also clearly not, some of this is not going to make universities better for free speech, obviously, if they have to shutter an academic department that the federal government doesn't like. And so, that's the issue there. And when it comes to the question of whether, people more broadly think that there's a improved speech climate, I don't think that's been the case either. There was some recent polling that just came out from FIRE that said that people kind of across the aisle are feeling more pessimistic about free expression, which isn't what you want to see. And also, especially in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination. Both the assassination itself and the really censorial response to people who were saying negative things about Charlie Kirk, students also had a negative reaction to that and felt that free speech on campus was getting worse, either from the violence or the threat of punishment for talking about it. So I think we actually are in a pretty bad spot right now. But what we need is principled First Amendment advocacy and making clear that everyone's rights need to be defended, because that's the only way that everyone's rights are defended. You,
and by you, I mean FIRE released, you do this on a regular basis, but it was a finding recently that, was it 72% or 75% of students say that shouting down a speaker or using violence is sometimes okay to stop a speaker. What was the exact? I need to double check the exact number. I can get that to you. But the number is going up of students who think that violence might be an acceptable response. And that's, that's kind of the really thick, bright line on when there's a problem. The idea I was going to ask what, do you know, and maybe this is just too Jesuitical, but, is that because, students are imagining somebody saying, like, let's get guns and go kill those people over there. And so violence might be okay to stop a mob from gathering. Because it it's almost it's like inconceivable to me that, more and more students would say that violence is an acceptable way of dictating the terms of debate on a college campus in particular.
Yeah, no, I think it wasn't that kind of speech that they were being polled about. It was, a list of, here's the kind of speaker. Is it acceptable to do this? Or is it acceptable at any point to, and I don't think they were suggested that you need to step in to stop some kind of violent attack. So, no, I think the, suggestion was, are there kinds of speech that are, so unwelcome that it's appropriate to use that kind of method? And, that's kind of like the most basic question for free speech, right? Can a mob stop you from speaking? If the answer is maybe yes, you have a lot of problems.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we will end it on that cheery note. We'll end this episode of The Reason interview with Nick Gillespie. I've been talking with Sarah McLaughlin, who is a senior scholar at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and her new book is Authoritarians in the Academy: How the Internationalization of Higher Education and Borderless Censorship Threaten Free Speech. Sarah, thanks so much for talking.
Thanks for having me.